So welcome everyone to this first in a series of two about writing skills. My name is Dr Aofie Sadlier. I'm an academic here at MLA College. So in this first of the two, then we're going to try and understand the nuts and bolts of academic writing. Now, so this is a useful topic as you go in to write your MSc dissertation, because it's not only about generating good ideas, but it's also about having a piece that's written structurally well with good language and all those nuts and bolts of basic language. So I think it's important to start from that starting point. So the overview of the workshop series, so there's going to be two workshops. So as I said, this first workshop is going to be about understanding nuts and bolts of academic writing. And the second workshop, which I think should be towards the end of March, date to be confirmed, is all about developing research approaches and critical thinking skills. So more about how do we carry out research, what approaches do we use, how do we think about literature critically, basically. So that will be the second workshop. But for today, there are a few learning outcomes for the workshop. So basically, the first one would be to understand, say, the difference between formal and informal writing. So we use the kind of formal writing in academic work. So for instance, topics such as difference between active and passive voice, third or first person, and also kind of formal tone or colloquial language. So we're aiming for the use of the first of each of those pairs really in this form of writing. We're also going to think a bit more about writing structure. So for instance, paragraphing, signposting within text so that sections make, link together really well. And then finally, thirdly, to understand and be able to use Harvard citational practice, which we use in MLA, both in text and in the reference list. So they're the three main learning outcomes for this workshop. There'll be a few kind of interactive exercises as we go along. If it's possible to use the chat box to write in any comments you may have, or if there's anything you want to add to the examples I'm giving, then feel free to add them in there. And there'll be a chance later on also to ask some questions as well towards the end of this little workshop. Now, I hope you also managed to have a look at the abstract exercise, basically, which was attached to this invitation. So there were 4 abstracts on this, and later we're going to kind of rate them in order in terms of which you think is the best kind of abstract in terms of academic writing, and which you think is sort of the worst or not very well written. If you haven't had a chance to look at it, then don't worry. I also have it here, and I can always share the screen if that helps. So basically, let's go then. Why does academic writing practice matter? Well, you might have your own opinions on this, and you can also add them into the chat box. So essentially, I would say it allows us to express our ideas clearly, ensures that we're communicating in an appropriate style. It allows us to reference the work of others clearly and effectively. Offers an opportunity to describe and analyze work within the existing literature. Now, that's a really important point in academic writing, that you're not just putting speculations out there, but that you're actually backing up the points you make with literature. And it enables us to showcase our critical thinking skills. So we're not just describing what some article is about, but we're analyzing it and saying, what are the strengths and limitations of this piece of work in relation to my topic, essentially. So there are some things I would put forward as kind of why academic writing practice matters. But of course, you can tell me what you think later as well. So There are a couple of key messages I want to put out there for this workshop series that might help you as you're writing your dissertation. So firstly, if in doubt, check it out. So as we go along, you will see I'll be talking about things like spelling, grammar. If you're unsure about any information within a source, the simplest thing is to not be lazy, but to actually check. I mean, for spelling, you have spell checkers on word processing programs and things like that. So there's kind of no excuse. Secondly, if in doubt, leave it out. So if you're writing something and you're over the word limit, for instance, and there's some paragraph that you're thinking to yourself, does this fit? Does it not? Then just follow your gut instinct, take the thing out because you're already looking for things to leave out. That's just one example. So they're my kind of two key messages, and we'll kind of go through them as I go along. So I'm going to start on this topic of formal versus informal writing. So we need to think about what is formal writing, which is the kind of academic style of writing that we're referring to for this MSc thesis. Well, basically, it's writing that adopts clear formal language. So we're not using colloquial or slang words. For instance, you're not writing in a way you had with your friend last night when you had a conversation. Basically, that's not the style you're writing, or you're not writing in the style of a text message where you can use the number 4 for 4. That's just, those kind of things are out the door. So you have to think of it that way. It's not like a conversation with your friend, although of course you can be friends with your supervisor if you want, but it's not that style of writing as in a conversation. It's something more formal than that. As I said, references the work of scholars to discuss a topic and to build a line of argumentation. So basically you need to have references for each key point you are making. Otherwise, it is not scholarly sound, and that is not appropriate for an MSc dissertation. You need to reference. So you're also answering or debating a specific question or field. So it's a very focused style of writing. So you're not writing about a broad topic, you're writing about something very specific in relation to an overall topic. So for instance, the topic of marine environmental pollution is really broad, but you might look at a particular aspect of that, like educational approaches to marine environment pollution or whatever it is, something much more specific. It has clear layout and structure. So, you need to have paragraphs. The paragraphs need to make sense in relation to one another. You have sections that also follow a logical flow. And we'll talk about that a bit later. And finally, it's grammatically correct. So you need to make sure that your writing is correct on a grammatical level within English language. So those are kind of key points. I actually took them from a Learn Higher document, but they make a lot of sense. They are really the key, key aspects of academic writing or good practice within academic writing. So I'm going to go through some common issues that I often see when I'm going through students' work. And if you can avoid some of the things I'm talking about here, then your writing will be improved considerably. So one of the first issues is using the passive voice. So basically, I should explain what passive voice is. So this occurs when the subject of the sentence has something done to it by someone or something. And the active voice is when the subject of the sentence is performing the action. Now, I'll give you an example so this makes sense in a minute. So passive voice should generally be avoided in academic writing. You should aim to use the active voice. So you will see in this example on the next slide. So the active voice, which is the better one to use, this is an example. The salt water corroded the metal beams. So basically you're putting the subject first. Active, and then the passive voice the metal beams were corroded by the salt water. So as you can see, it's not completely incorrect, but it's just a bit awkward. So you're turning the sentence around and you're saying something was corroded by, instead of just saying it directly, the salt water corroded. Now, it might seem quite subtle, but the active voice makes a big difference within academic writing, and it makes it much more polished. It also notice it takes up a bit less words as well. So if you're ever stuck for word count, that's another kind of tool you can use to get your words down a bit, and it's also better writing. So that is kind of one common issue first that I often see in people's writing. Second one, and this is a major one, is failing to reference. So if you make comments in your writing without actually backing them up, general comments, then that is a problem within academic writing. It's fine if you're having a conversation with your friend, for instance. You don't have to say, Paul 2020 said this, but it's different when you're actually writing about someone's work. These were the ideas they put forward, so you need to reference it. So they all need to be backed up with relevant literature. Otherwise, it'll be purely speculation, essentially. As I said, scientific work requires you to build on existing literature and findings. So that is really important that you reference. So this is one example I have here that you can look at yourself as well. So essentially, you'll see here that there are statements made, but there are no references really made. So deforestation and the destruction of rainforests are connected to climate change. 1 football field of forest is destroyed every 6 seconds. This is a startling statistic which highlights the need for humans to deal with planetary degradation immediately. So you can probably see from this statement that, basically, especially the fact about football field of forest destroyed every 6 seconds, where did that point of reference or statistic actually come from? Just leaving it like that without a reference is not really scholarly sound. So you need to avoid stuff like that. You need to reference all points made, any statistics you have, you need to say where they come from. And if you want to be really polished with your referencing, then even include the page number for where that statistic was quoted. So for example, page 7 or 8 or whatever it is. So that example kind of shows, this is an example of kind of bad practice here on the slide, that you need to reference all points made. A third common issue that I often see is, basically lacking focus. So all research must have a clear focus and line of argumentation, building on existing literature. Also, your research scope should not be too broad, and that means the subject area that you're studying should be a focused aspect of a topic, not just like everything about this topic that's ever been written. So for example, I have on the next slide an example of this. So this thesis will examine the history of shipbuilding from prehistory to the present. Now, I don't know what you would think about, you can write in the chat box maybe what you would think about the key issues with this are. But essentially, a statement like this is sort of flawed for what you're doing at MSc level or even at PhD level, because this topic is far too broad. You could write probably 10 encyclopedias with 1,000 pages each on this topic, but for what you're doing, it needs to be a much more focused project. So you look at a part of the history of shipbuilding or whatever, but not the history of shipbuilding from prehistory to the present, because that's far too broad. So I know this is a very simple example and a bit simplistic, but just wants to get across the point that you need to think about the angle on your topic and that what you're writing about is focused and narrow enough, especially for, you know, a quite short thesis. So yeah, even at PhD level, a topic like this would be far too broad. So, okay, so that's another key example. Now, the fourth of 5 issues on this regard is basically the use of the personal voice. So scientific writing should generally be objective, and the personal voice, for example, I, me, my, things like that, should be used very sparingly. Now, I don't say not at all, because occasionally it can be used, but not in every sentence, like saying, I believe this, I argue that, you know, it needs to be more built on existing literature. So Peterson 2020 argues that. So that style of writing. So it should be objective, really. I actually come from an arts and humanities background, and it is a little bit different in arts humanities. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but you can actually use the personal voice more. But for this style of writing, it's more scientific, objective, use it very sparingly. It's fine in more reflective writing. So if you're writing a reflection on your work experience or whatever, then you can use personal voice. But in general, when you're writing your MSc dissertation, just try to avoid things like I, me, my, or even we, or anything like that, and try and keep it more, more general. Main point is to build a line of argumentation, drawing on work of relevant scholars. I know I've said that a number of times, but it is important. And the third person should be employed most frequently. The first person only occasionally, and second person, which is you should do this, you're this, that should actually be avoided completely. So aim for the use of the third person. So again, I have a couple of examples here that we can look at, and you can read them yourself, but an example of good practice and not so good practice. So this first example is what I'm talking about when I say kind of using the third person more. So for example, Muller 2017 and Davidson 2018 argue that COVID-19 has had a major impact on shipping personnel, creating a precarious and stressful work environment. The authors offer various strategies for addressing these issues, notably increased training in crisis management, yet their work can be critiqued on the basis that extrapolated this information from a small number of interviews with shipping personnel staff in one company. So you see here that this example, we keep it neutral, objective. We're not using, I argue this, you should do this, because that style of writing is not so appropriate to what you're doing in, say, an MSc or a BSc thesis, for example. And this is not such a good example because it uses mainly first person and also second person throughout. So I argue that Muller 2017 and Davidson 2018 offer good strategies for mitigating the impacts of COVID-19 on shipping personnel staff. Yet I also believe that the work has shortcomings, as they only interviewed a small number of research participants. You could further expand these findings by interviewing employees from multiple companies. Now, I think actually the last sentence of that is probably the worst. I was like, that sort of voice, you could do this, is just, it's almost like you're having a conversation with your friend, as I said, which you sort of want to avoid in this form of writing, really. So there are kind of two clear examples that kind of talk about, yeah, basically the use of first and third person and which is better. So I hope that is pretty clear. Now, the fifth and last issue in this section, I'm just going to highlight, and again, it's quite a simple thing, but spelling, grammar, and punctuation are extremely important when reading through MSc theses, and they can actually have an impact on the overall mark, you know. So they have an impact on how information is conveyed, essentially. And so it is important. There is no excuse really, because there are spell checkers on word processing engines, is online spell checkers that you can use to help you with these things. And also the spell checkers also identify punctuation and grammar errors as well. So it's really important to use those. All you have to do is set your default language as English UK, and there should be no problems. So I would advise to check through all your work in advance of submission to ensure accuracy, using the word processing spell checker, for instance, to help you in that matter. So some example of common errors I actually see when I go through MSc and BSc thesis or essays is, say, this difference between there, which is T-H-E-R-E, and there, which is T-H-E-I-R. So the first one refers to kind of location, the second one to possession. So for instance, if you're referring to something over there, then it's T-H-E-R-E. If you're referring to their books, so it belongs to them, T-H-E-I-R. Now, I know it's quite a simple thing, but I do actually see that error quite often. Second is affect with the A and effect with the E. So the first one is sort of a process, and the second with the E is the outcome of that process. So you could say that climate change is affecting the polar ice caps, that's with an A. But the melting of ice is the effect with an E of that climate change. So I hope that makes sense. The first is a process, the second is the outcome of that process. That is quite a common mistake. So just try and take note of that one as well. The third one I'm going to mention is possession. So, for example, sometimes I see people writing a plural, say like the word birds, but they may be referring to an aspect of possession, like the bird's nest, which requires the apostrophe being after the S because it refers to a possession of the birds. I hope that makes sense, but sometimes there is a tendency to leave out the apostrophe, because if you're referring to something belonging to possession, so the birds own the nest, so the birds apostrophe nest is the correct form, not the birds without an apostrophe, because that doesn't make sense grammatically. So the plural possessive or the singular possessive as well, so not forgetting the apostrophe before the S if you're referring to one bird, at bird's nest, for instance. Now I know those are really simple examples, but there are three kind of common errors that I see going through work quite a lot. And so they're important to take note of, really. So this is my first key message that I've mentioned already, really. So if in doubt, check it out. So that could refer to stuff like spelling. It can refer to, even if you're unsure of what an actual text or article you've read is actually about, and you're just referencing it randomly and not sure, then have a look through the abstract again and make sure that what you're actually saying is scholarly sound. So really, there's no room to be lazy. That's what I'm trying to say. If there are tools there to help you, then use them to make sure that what you're doing is scholarly sound or grammatically correct, for instance. So now you might be wondering why there's a picture of a panda on the slide, but we couldn't get the copyright for the image of the book I want to talk about, but there is a panda on the cover of that book, so that's why I have it there. Basically, this is a really good book on grammar and punctuation if you have issues with those aspects especially. It's readily available on Amazon or any other site. You can even pick up copies of it for about 99p used. So it's called Eats, Shoots and Leaves, but it's a really, really good guide to punctuation and grammar. If you want to read more on that topic, I do recommend it. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the second main learning outcome, which is related to writing structure. Now, there are a number of key components I'm going to talk about here. So firstly, sentences. So basically each sentence should follow on from the preceding one in a logical order. And paragraphs are also important. I would recommend that each paragraph should have, I would say, at least 3 sentences in order to be considered a paragraph, really, and should make a key point. You can basically move on to a new paragraph to address a new issue which follows on from the previous paragraph. So it is important that you use paragraphs in your writing, because otherwise you'll just have blocks of text that make it quite hard for the reader to navigate what you're writing about. So paragraphing is important, but also paragraphs just can't be like 1 sentence or even 2 sentences, because otherwise it's not really making a point. You need a few sentences in order for it to be considered a paragraph, really. And then there are sections. So each section should conclude by providing a brief summary of what has been discussed and a linking sentence to the next section. So these linking sentences are also called signposts. So that's what I referred to at the start of this workshop, where I mentioned signposting. So it's essentially, as you go throughout your thesis and throughout the different sections, it's important to always like summarize what you have discussed and also look forward to the next section, so the reader isn't left wondering, oh, what is this next section about? How does that relate to the last one? You should always make your work and your writing just as clear as and as easy for the reader, really, as you possibly can. So those 3 aspects are really important: sentences, then the larger group of sentences, paragraphs, and then the larger scope of the whole thesis in its sections, basically. So some useful tips I would have in this regard, as you clarify your writing, and especially in the later times, as you are going to submit your thesis. The first one would be to make every word count. Now, this means that when you're looking through your thesis, when you have most of it together, read through every single sentence and say, is this as clear and concise as it possibly can be? Am I using words that are unnecessary? Because if you are, just take those words out, especially if you're over a word count. I use this word pruning, and I say it to students quite a lot if they're over the word count. That means getting out your garden shears, going through the text and removing any words like, say, very or particularly, or just words that are not necessary to convey your meaning. If they're there, and well, you should take them out anyway, really, but especially if you're up and over a word count, just get them out, because it's amazing if you go through a whole text, pruning the text first, then you can actually get rid of hundreds of words alone in a whole MSc thesis, for instance, just by doing that, going through, taking out unnecessary words that are not needed to convey your meaning. And the same goes, of course, for like paragraphs of information. If you're unsure of whether a paragraph or a few sentences here and there are really relevant or necessary, just take them out. This applies really even if you're not over a word count, but because you have to aim for clarity in your writing as much as you possibly can. So anything that you say, you just think to yourself, that really isn't necessary, or it's not really answering my question, just take it out. Your writing will be better. And if you're over a word count, you'll automatically, already get rid of some words. And that brings me to my second point. If in doubt, leave it out. Follow your instinct and be ruthless, I would say. Because ultimately, you can hand in work that it's coherent and it makes sense, and the topic is there. But if you read through, and like as an examiner or whatever, and you read through and you think, oh, but the writing isn't quite polished, and that it's just been buffered by extra sentences or paragraphs that are not necessary, then that is not good. So I would always read through, especially when you have the whole thesis together, and just check every sentence, every paragraph, every section. Is that necessary for my argument and for answering my research question? And that's why I say be ruthless. Basically, I would say to people, you have to maybe go for a walk, do some different activity, different than looking at the screen in your MSc dissertation, take on a different persona, and then come back and pretend you're someone else reading your thesis as if you have never seen this work before. I know I did this myself in my PhD thesis, especially when preparing for a Viva exam. And you'd be amazed what this does when you change your role and persona and you pretend to be someone else, and you go, oh, but why is she saying that there? Or why is he saying that there? And then you realize, oh, that section was really not necessary. Or yeah, you begin to kind of, be a better critic of your own writing. So try and put on a different hat, essentially, and read through your thesis as if you've never seen this before, and be ruthless then in taking out information that is not necessary. I'm going to go through some common issues now, maybe 3 or 4 related to the structure of writing, with some examples as well. So one issue, as I've already alluded to, is lacking structure and flow. So like logic and flow refers to both the overall structure of the thesis and the links between sections and paragraphs. So basically your whole thesis should be structurally sound, but also sections and paragraphs need to link together. So the whole thing needs to flow, basically. It's like the water you see in the background there in the waterfall. That's the way it needs to be. No hard edges, essentially. This is an example I've here of connecting sentences. It's quite a simple example, but you'll see what I'm talking about here. So say this comes at the end of a section on your topic about marine pollution in Malaysian secondary schools. So you could write something like, this section has demonstrated that there is a great need to develop strategies for teaching about marine pollution in Malaysian secondary schools. In the next section, these thoughts will be taken forward by offering strategies for how this may be implemented. So you see here, this is kind of a tool you can use. The first sentence kind of reflects back on what the section has done, and the second sentence reflects forward to what is going to go in the next section of your thesis. So connecting sentences, as I mentioned, are important to ensure you have a good flow in your thesis, and that you're both summarizing effectively and looking forward and pointing, signposting to what you're going to be doing next. So if you can use tools like that in your writing as you go along, then it's really helpful, and it's helpful for the reader, essentially, as you're going through. This is an example of overall structure. And now this is an example, it's not such a good example of practice, and you can probably see why, but I will I will go through that in a minute. So you can read it yourself, but here is the example. The expected findings of this research are that Malaysian schools are not doing enough to teach young adults aged 13 to 18 about marine pollution. This thesis will identify approaches for implementing relevant strategies. Previous research has highlighted that there is a lack of education on marine pollution in Malaysian schools. Therefore, this research will ask what existing approaches are being employed, how can these be improved? Interviews with governmental officials and survey data from 100 Malaysian youths aged 13 to 18 will be analysed. So you're probably saying to yourself, I hope that this paragraph or this sort of abstract doesn't make much sense because the structure is not quite right. Because this particular abstract you see here on the screen, it starts with expected findings. So you wouldn't really start an abstract by saying what you expect to find. You start an abstract by more talking about what the issue is or what the existing literature is on it. So basically, you wouldn't start with the first sentence or the second sentence there. You'd more start where there's previous research is highlighted. So the third sentence would really be at the start of this abstract, then the research questions, then the description of methods, which is the last sentence on this slide, before going to the expected findings, which is at the very start of this abstract. So you'll see that this abstract, as I have it on the screen here, needs to be reordered considerably. So really think about the structure of every paragraph you're writing, so that it moves on logically from one point to another. So from previous research to a research question to a methodology to expected findings, and not the other way around. I hope that makes sense. But that's one example you can look back on just as an example of poor overall structure, essentially, and needs to be addressed. So a second key error, I think I'm going to go through 3 in total in this section, basically sentences that never end. Now, this is an issue because often I see writing where there's a very, very big long sentence that looks like a roadblock. So that could be divided maybe into 2 or 3 sentences, really. So keep your sentences short and concise. I would recommend that is the easiest way of making sure you have clear writing. You can use commas, colons, and semicolons, so different forms of punctuation to join sentences effectively in some cases. For example, colons can be used before a list of items, commas to link clauses, things like that. But do not let sentences run on for too long if they can be more comfortably be divided into 2 or more sentences. So I have one example here that we can look at. So this is just a sentence I made up. And you can probably see what the issues are with this immediately. So Arnoldson 2004 explored the impact of climate change on polar ice caps, identifying human activities such as the burning of carbon as key aspects of global climate change, and hypothesizing that by 2050 the polar caps will be almost completely depleted, which seems likely. So that sentence is very long, as you see, very long-winded. It obscures any clarity. So basically, if I were to look at this sentence, I don't know what you think, but I would stop the first sentence after global climate change. So, and then I would start a new sentence on Arnoldson hypothesized that by 2050 the polar caps will be almost completely depleted. So there essentially should be 2 sentences here, not one giant long sentence. And actually the very last part, which seems likely, that's completely just obsolete. Like it's not necessary for conveying your meaning. So that's another example of pruning, where you can just take out that very last part, which seems likely because it's absolutely not needed. So that's one example of, again, not so good writing practice on this slide. So as you can see, this can certainly be divided up into 2 sentences, also taking out some words. So now we're going to move on to the abstract exercise. So I hope we've all managed to look at the abstracts. We might go through that now. So basically, I'm going to give you a chance to read the abstracts again. And we're going to basically rank the abstracts in order. The first, the best abstract being rated as 1, the worst abstract as 4. So I'm going to give you a few minutes to read through the abstracts again. And then we're going to basically in the chat function of Zoom, or even if you want to speak, so if you want to unmute yourself and say basically which abstract you think is well written, so which is number 1, down to number 4, which is the worst. You'll see that there are some instructions of how you analyze them within the document I sent you on. So related to writing structure, grammar, scientific writing style, things like that. So basically, and like I'll give you a couple of minutes to read through these abstracts again. Then I'm going to ask for your comments basically on these abstracts, which is the best. So number 1, which is number 2, 3, and down to 4. I hope everyone has the document, but I'm going to share my document screen anyway, so you can see it. And then chat box or speak, whichever you would prefer. And okay, so I'm gonna share. I'll share it now so you have it. Okay, I'm gonna move it down. And this is abstract 4. So you're thinking about these abstracts in terms of their scientific writing, language, writing structure, these sorts of things, and ranking them, yeah, from 1 at best to 4 at worst. And we're going to discuss in, I'll give you a couple more minutes, then discuss what ranking you'd use and why, just so we can think about some of the points I've been making so far. So would we be okay to start talking through the abstracts then? Or do you need a bit more time? Okay, so I see some responses here. Great. So yes, I take your point, Carlos, about difference between humanities and science abstracts. I certainly can relate to that because, well, I come from an arts humanities background, yeah, myself. So we write in quite a different way. So almost since I came to MLA, I've kind of been getting used to more, yeah, kind of more scientific. Yes, I'm just looking through. Yeah, good, because I haven't been following the comments so far. So 3, 2, 1, 4. That's also what I thought personally myself. And we could talk about why in a minute. 2, 3, 1, 4. Okay. Context, I take your point. Paul, abstract 4 is definitely the worst. I would agree. We can talk about why. I'm getting a lot of 3, 2, 1, 4. 1, 1, 3, 2, 4. Okay, so we have a general consensus about the order then, 3, 2, 1, 4. Does anyone want to comment about why they chose that order? In like microphone, I presume you can put on your microphone, but if not. Anyone in particular? No? Well, I can offer my comments on why I would choose that order personally. Now, abstract 3, I think, is good in that it has a structure, a clear overall structure with introduction, methods, results, and conclusion. So it's all clearly outlined. It includes some findings as well. So I think overall the abstract is kind of the most sound overall, if I were to choose. Abstract 2, I would probably personally, although of course some of this is subjective, but I would probably put abstract 2 second. There's a good overall introduction to the topic. There's a discussion of findings, which is quite detailed. I would say a little bit more maybe is required in this one on methodology, what approach was used to collect this data, because it's not absolutely clear. But overall, I would put this one second, because I think abstract one, which is the one I would say is second worst out of these, it doesn't contain really clear procedures related to the research or its significance. The first sentence is okay, but after that it goes kind of wayward, and it kind of uses the first person, we did this, we did that, which again in humanities we might say, oh, you can do that in an abstract, but I think more in scientific writing should be avoided. It only really discusses the organization of the paper. So I would probably put that one second worst and put abstract 2 as a bit better than that one if I were judging. I think we're all agreed on abstract 4 being the least scholarly sound. It's, of course, you can have different word limits for abstracts, but it is extremely short. There's spelling errors you might have noticed in it. It's not very coherent, uses the personal voice in an abstract. I personally think that one is a clearly, basically, not the best. There's a question about should abstracts include references or not. Generally, I avoid references in abstracts, although sometimes I see it being done with references. And different universities, colleges, conferences have slightly different guidelines on abstracts. So I would clarify that with the particular university. In general, as a rule of thumb, I would say you don't need references in an abstract necessarily. It's a very skeleton summary of what you're writing about. When some circumstances, people do use them. So check out the context, I would say. Yes, hand is up. Yes.
Fine.
Yes, hello. Have you
Can
got?
I? It's Sergio speaking. I don't know if that
Yes.
appears somewhere. I
Yes.
think the question you got for referencing is because I read many abstract, never saw references, and then I was told now for the first time that they must be there, and from our supervisor from Greece. And in fact, if you see in the forum, there is 20 abstracts, and the 4-5 that comes from Greece with reference, which is fine. I just now would like to understand between the two of you, because you're saying not, Chris saying yes. So what must we do next?
Again, I think it goes back to the point I made about different institutions having different policies. Maybe in Greece, this is done more commonly. And as I said, I've seen in certain conferences, for instance, in their guidelines that they say, you know, abstracts can include references. I would say,
I think personally it helped me because now I have them already and
yeah,
they're ready. When I'm going to write, I got them. I don't
yeah,
know if it makes it makes the abstract look a bit longer. And if the word counting counts the word, you go out your word counting, if it counts the references.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it starts to back up what you're saying, where without reference, no one knows if
yeah,
what you're saying is true or not.
yeah.
But
But
just, I don't know.
an abstract is a summary of research, essentially. Yeah. So,
The other thing is that our was not an abstract because abstract has conclusions and we don't have conclusion because we haven't even started yet.
well,
So
yeah,
that was probably our issue as well. That
yes. Yeah. I mean, this is at this stage is just a very summary abstract of what you expect to do. I guess I'm more talking about if you have the research done already, what way your abstract will be written then, essentially.
no,
Um, yeah.
that's I think one of the problems was that ours was not supposed to be called abstract, and
Yeah.
it was more
I
of
mean,
an intro to your proposal.
mm,
And
mm,
maybe that makes also difference into should the reference be there or not.
yeah.
Considering ours wasn't an abstract, maybe it's good to start with the reference there. And if it is abstract, then your reference will be in the paper. So this
Yes.
could
Yeah.
be maybe,
Yeah.
so that's why we had to got them. Anyway, back to the abstract. I think I'm one of those that did the 3, 2, 1, 4, and I had few notes I just can share with you.
Yeah.
The three made me actually feel no need to go and read the paper, and that's why I liked it.
Yeah, it's
Because there was a
clear.
structure, and I got all I need. I actually, if I had to go into that paper, I wouldn't feel the need because title, intro, methods, they saw the solution and everything. So I actually wouldn't go and read the paper.
Yeah.
Where in the others, obviously, in two, there is also a kind of intro question and conclusion, but as you were saying, there's no structure, and that's
Yeah.
it gets a bit long. And when you're reading, you don't know where to stop, and then that's the only thing with two. And
Yeah.
then 1 and 4, there's many things that I
Yeah.
also the non-talking third person. There was lots of question, and I don't feel there is really an answer, a conclusion in number 1. And number 4, it's confusing. I don't even
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
The
Exactly
beginning
right.
says
Yeah.
security intrusion become an even bigger for the information society. Even bigger what? I wrote, I don't understand. I don't even understand what they're talking about. So obviously
Yeah. Yeah,
that was
exactly. I
my
think very similar comments basically to what I thought then. Thanks for that. Um, I'm just going to do a final section in this presentation very quickly on referencing. Does anyone else have any other comments they want to make on the abstract? Or we're all happy just from, I'll just do the final section on a very quick section on referencing before we'll finish up. And then you can ask any extra questions you might have as well. So this very final section. So we've just done this, what are your thoughts on the pieces, which is more successful? So we've generally come to a consensus 3, 2, 1, 4 based on the reasons sort of Sergio just mentioned there as well. This final, just very quick sort of section. So on referencing. So as I said, it's a very crucial part of academic writing. We're using Harvard citational practice, and that's really important. It's actually one of the easier systems of referencing, if I'm to be honest, to use. Things like Chicago referencing are more complicated, and you have to use footnotes sometimes to put references in. And yeah, so we're actually relatively lucky here. Needs to be consistent, not only in terms of layout, but also punctuation. Because sometimes people get the layout right, but then they're using commas in different places and the different journal articles, and it can become quite irritating when you're reading through. It's like a formula referencing. All you need to do is follow it, and no marks will be lost unnecessarily, because you kind of can lose marks if you're not referencing correctly in your work, especially at MSc level. Basically, this is the formula. So in-text referencing, if you're using it after the end of a sentence where you discuss some aspect or someone's work, basically open bracket, surname, comma, space, year, close bracket. That's the form it takes. It's quite simple. So for instance, my surname, Sadlier, comma, 2020, if it's one of my articles. If you include a direct quotation in quotation marks, so the double quotation marks or single, then you need to include a page number. I very often see quotes that haven't been referenced correctly because there's no page number from within the text where the quote was found. And so that is actually not correctly referenced in that case. Even if you've referenced the author, if you don't include a page number, that is not a full reference. If you use the author's name to start the sentence, basically, then the format should be surname, open bracket, year, close bracket. You should not start a sentence with a bracket. So it should not be the surname and year within brackets at the start of a sentence. That can be used at the end of a sentence where you've just talked about an author's work and then you put their details in brackets, but do not use it at the start of a sentence. It's just the surname and then the year in brackets. Note the placement of brackets. It's something I see very often when I'm reading through, so please do take note. The reference list then, all references should be in alphabetical order, starting from A to Z, according to the author's surname. Note that the different types of sources, so journal articles, book chapters, etc., have different referencing formats. So make sure that you check how a book chapter is referenced, how a journal article is referenced, and that you're following the formulas for each type. Note that keeping punctuation consistent is as important as the format of the reference itself. So both are important to ensure you're referencing correctly and consistently. So an article in a reference list, I've included an example here. So the surname, the author's initial, the year, the title of the article. The title of the journal itself should be in italics, not the title of the article. The title of the journal should be in italics. Volume number, issue number, page numbers. So they're the components you need to reference, for example, a journal article correctly. In text, you use either the author's surname and year in brackets, or if you're starting the sentence with the author's name, then the author's name with the year in brackets, as I've just mentioned. So that is one example of referencing. It would be different for a book chapter in terms of how you put it in the reference list. Now I've gone through everything, so I'm just going to review the learning outcomes before you can ask some questions if you would like, if there's anything else you want to know. So to understand the difference between formal and informal writing, to think more about writing structure, so paragraphing, signposting, and to understand and be able to use Harvard citational practice. So we've gone through those 3 key points, especially with using the abstract exercise as well. My 2 take-home messages are if in doubt, check it out. So if there's something you're not sure of, make sure you check it out in advance. Do not leave it to chance. If in doubt, leave it out. So prune your language and also go through every paragraph, sentence, everything to make sure it's all necessary to answer your question. Here are some references I drew on in this workshop presentation. So the Learn Higher document on what is academic writing, if you want to have a further look. And also the classic book on grammar and punctuation, Eats, Shoots and Leaves, which I recommend having a look at. Here are my contact details if you want to email me about anything to do with writing practice. And I want to thank you for taking part. Next workshop, end of March. But if there are any questions people want to ask now, then feel free. I'm going to stop the share. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, some little questions. Dialects or versions of Harvard style. For MLA, I usually just refer them to the Harvard style that's used in the How to Reference guide on the TLP, which there are definitely slight variations of Harvard style, and none is necessarily wrong, but I just encourage students to look at the version that's encouraged on the TLP, so the How to Reference document. Question on writing style. What is your advice and opinion on use of jargon and technical language? I always advise people to keep their basically language as direct and jargon-free as possibly can, because jargon, it's a bit like almost that 4th abstract we looked like there. There was kind of jargon in that, and you ended up not actually knowing what the author was talking about, really, besides it having grammatical errors and structural errors. It just wasn't easy to read for that reason. Obviously, a certain level of technical language is required depending on what topic you're talking about, especially in a scientific field or engineering. But in terms of just unnecessary language or jargon, try and leave as much of that out as you possibly can. And me, it's just reading through the whole pieces and asking yourself, does every question or does every sentence really matter here? Or, you know, pruning your language, as I mentioned again. Any other questions? No problem. Anything else? Well, it's been really great to hold this session today. Thank you all for attending. I know that there is going to be a second workshop at the end of March / the very start of April. We're going to confirm that very soon. And hopefully this session has been helpful just for thinking through the nuts and bolts of academic writing. So what is the basic statements you're making, the language you're using, the structure of what you're writing. The second section will cover more in depth, sort of how do you start doing research and do research well? How do you think critically? So that will be a slightly different type of workshop. But yes, it's been great to have you all here. I hope it's been helpful. I think this session is available online afterwards, so you can look back over it again if that is helpful. So thank you very much, everyone. And we will see you at the second workshop then. Okay, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.